In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where the elevation exceeds 1,900 meters and the landscape is a vast plateau of sagebrush and sandstone mesas cut by dry washes, there is a canyon called Chaco. The canyon itself is unremarkable in its physical dimensions, a shallow declivity perhaps 15 kilometers long and rarely more than a kilometer wide, walled by low sandstone cliffs that rise to perhaps 30 meters at their highest points. There is no permanent water source of any significance. The annual rainfall is minimal, among the lowest of any inhabited region in North America. The growing season is short and unpredictable, threatened by frost in nearly every direction of the calendar. By almost every conventional measure of what makes a landscape suitable for supporting a complex society, Chaco Canyon should not have become what it became. And yet, between approximately 850 and 1150 of the Common Era, the Ancestral Pueblo people, the civilization that occupied the canyon and that anthropologists once called the Anasazi, before that term was recognized as both linguistically inappropriate and historically imprecise, built within this canyon a series of structures whose scale, precision, and astronomical sophistication remain among the most remarkable achievements of any pre-contact civilization in North America. The largest of these structures, a complex called Pueblo Bonito, contained more than 600 rooms across 4 or 5 stories, organized in a shape that approximates a D, with a great curving wall on its northern side and a flat wall facing the canyon's open plaza to the south. Pueblo Bonito alone represents one of the largest buildings constructed in North America before the 19th century, and it was only one of more than a dozen comparably ambitious great houses built within the canyon over roughly 3 centuries. The specific construction of these great houses involved a scale of masonry work that has no clear precedent in the earlier archaeological record of the American Southwest. The Coran veneer wall technique that the Chacoan builders developed, in which a rubble core was faced on both sides with carefully selected and shaped sandstone, allowed for walls of extraordinary height and thickness, some reaching more than a meter in width at their base and supporting structures that rose several stories. The specific sandstone used for the veneer was selected and dressed with an attention to pattern and texture that goes beyond structural necessity, producing facades whose banded and patterned stonework, some of it using small tablets of stone laid in deliberate decorative arrangements, suggests an aesthetic ambition as well as an engineering one. What makes Chaco Canyon extraordinary, beyond the sheer scale of its architecture in an environment that could not have supported the population needed to build it through local agricultural production alone, is the precision with which its major structures were oriented to astronomical phenomena. Windows, doorways, and entire building axes at multiple Chacoan great houses align with remarkable accuracy to the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices, to the cardinal directions, and in at least one documented case to the complex 18.6-year cycle of the moon. This was not approximate alignment of the kind that might occur by chance or by loose attention to the cardinal directions. It was precision repeated across multiple structures and multiple alignments, suggesting an astronomical knowledge system of considerable sophistication, maintained and applied by a society that left behind no system of writing through which to record how they came to know what they knew. The canyon's specific name, Chaco, derives from a Spanish corruption of a Navajo word, and the question of what the canyon's original builders called the place, or whether they conceived of it through a single unified name at all rather than through a constellation of specific place names attached to its individual features, is one of the many basic questions about the canyon that the absence of a written record leaves permanently uncertain. What we call Chaco Canyon today is a modern designation applied to a landscape whose original conceptual and linguistic framework, the categories through which its builders understood and named their own world, has not survived in any directly recoverable form. The specific scale of the labor and resource investment required to build Chaco's great houses, in a landscape that could not support large populations through local agriculture alone, immediately raises the central interpretive puzzle that runs through every subsequent chapter of Chacoan archaeology. How did a society without centralized political institutions of the kind associated with ancient states elsewhere in the world organize the sustained, large-scale cooperation that the canyons' monumental architecture clearly required, and what would have motivated communities scattered across a wide and ecologically marginal landscape to invest so heavily in a place that could not have supported them on its own? The Ancestral Pueblo civilization that built Chaco Canyon was part of a broader cultural tradition that occupied the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, the area where the modern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet, for more than 1,000 years before the canyon's monumental period, and that continues today in the form of the contemporary Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who consider the builders of Chaco Canyon to be among their direct ancestors. The deeper history of ancestral Pueblo culture in the Southwest extends back to the basket-maker period, beginning around 1500 BCE, when the peoples of the region began the transition from a primarily hunting and gathering economy to one increasingly based on maize agriculture, supplemented by beans and squash in the agricultural complex that anthropologists call the Three Sisters, and that was shared across much of pre-contact North America. The specific adoption and adaptation of maize agriculture to the arid and semi-arid conditions of the Southwest, which required specific techniques for water management and soil conservation that the ancestral Pueblo farmers developed over many centuries, was the foundation on which all subsequent developments in the region's history depended. The Pueblo I period, beginning around 750 CE, saw the development of larger and more permanent settlements, the elaboration of ceremonial architecture in the form of kivas, the circular subterranean or semi-subterranean structures that remain a defining feature of Pueblo ceremonial life to the present day, and the development of the black-on-white pottery tradition that would become one of the most distinctive and most widely traded craft products of the ancestral Pueblo world. It was out of this broader cultural context, already several centuries deep in its own historical development, that the specific fluorescence of Chaco Canyon emerged in the 9th century. The specific question of why Chaco Canyon, rather than any of the dozens of other canyons and valleys of the San Juan Basin with comparable or even superior agricultural potential, became the center of this monumental development is one that archaeologists have approached from multiple angles without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. The canyon's specific topography, its orientation, and its relationship to certain prominent landscape features including Fajada Butte, the isolated sandstone formation at the canyon's eastern end that contains one of the most famous archaeoastronomical features of the entire site, may have given the location a ritual significance that preceded and motivated its later monumental development, though the evidence for this earlier significance is necessarily indirect. The broader environmental context of the San Juan Basin during the centuries of Chacoan development is itself a subject of considerable archaeological interest, because the canyon's monumental period coincided with a period of relatively favorable climatic conditions across much of the Southwest, a window of increased and more reliable precipitation that would have supported the agricultural surpluses needed to sustain both the canyon's own modest population and the broader system of exchange and ceremonial gathering that connected it to outlying communities. The specific relationship between this favorable climatic window and the timing of Chaco's monumental development, while not a sufficient explanation on its own, is an important piece of the broader context within which the canyon's rise must be understood. The archaeological sequence preceding Chaco's monumental period, documented through excavation of the canyon's earlier basket-maker and Pueblo I period sites, shows a gradual increase in settlement size, architectural elaboration, and ceremonial investment that provides the immediate cultural foundation from which the dramatic 9th century transformation of the canyon emerged. This gradual development means that Chaco's monumental architecture, however abrupt its visual impact on the modern visitor, represents the culmination of centuries of incremental cultural development rather than a sudden and unprecedented innovation. The specific transition from Pueblo I period settlement patterns, characterized by smaller and more dispersed communities, to the nucleated and monumentally ambitious settlement pattern that Chaco represents, has been the subject of considerable archaeological debate regarding the specific social and demographic processes that drove this transformation, with some researchers emphasizing population growth and agricultural intensification as the primary drivers and others emphasizing the development of new ceremonial and ideological systems that motivated communities to invest collectively in monumental construction projects that exceeded what any single community's practical needs would have required. The specific evidence for ritual feasting and ceremonial gathering that distinguishes the monumental development hypothesis from a simpler population growth explanation includes the disproportionate investment in ceremonial architecture, the great kivas, and the elaborately decorated great house facades, relative to the more modest domestic architecture that characterized ordinary ancestral Pueblo settlements throughout the broader region during the same period, suggesting that whatever combination of factors drove Chaco's development, ceremonial and ideological motivations played a role at least as significant as straightforward demographic or economic pressures. The astronomical sophistication of Chaco Canyon's architecture is most dramatically illustrated by the Sun Dagger, a petroglyph and rock formation on Fajada Butte that was documented in the 1970s by the artist and researcher Anna Sofar and that has become one of the most widely cited examples of pre-contact astronomical observation anywhere in the Americas. The Sun Dagger consists of 3 large sandstone slabs positioned in front of a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock face behind them, in such a way that at the summer solstice, a dagger-shaped beam of sunlight passing between the slabs falls precisely through the center of the spiral. At the winter solstice, 2 separate daggers of light frame the spiral's edges. At the equinoxes, a different alignment occurs, with a dagger of light bisecting a smaller adjacent spiral. The precision of this effect, which requires the exact positioning of the slabs relative to the petroglyph and relative to the specific angle of the sun's path at different points in the year, indicates a sustained program of astronomical observation that would have required years, if not generations, of careful watching and adjustment to achieve. The broader archaeoastronomical research conducted at Chaco Canyon since the 1970s, building on Sofar's foundational work, has identified solar and lunar alignments in the architecture of multiple great houses throughout the canyon. The Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada, one of the largest ceremonial structures in the canyon, has its main doorway and an interior niche aligned with remarkable precision to the rising sun at the summer solstice. Pueblo Bonito's complex, multi-walled architecture includes corner windows and building axes that align with solar and lunar events. The specific alignment of Chetroquetl, another of the major great houses, with the cardinal directions and with certain solstice positions has been documented with comparable precision. The lunar alignments documented at Chaco are particularly significant because they require knowledge of a cycle that takes 18.6 years to complete, far longer than any single human observation could capture, and requiring either an extraordinarily long-term observational program maintained across multiple generations or knowledge transmitted from a source whose original observational basis is now lost to us. The specific architectural alignment at Chimney Rock, an outlying Chacoan site in Colorado, with the rising position of the moon at its major standstill, an event that occurs only once every 18.6 years, is one of the most precise and most widely accepted examples of lunar astronomical alignment in the pre-contact archaeological record of North America. The specific methodology that Anna Sofar and her collaborators employed to document and verify the Sun Dagger alignment, involving sustained observation across multiple solar years to confirm that the effect was a consistent and intentional feature of the site rather than a coincidental occurrence, established a rigorous evidentiary standard for archaeoastronomical research at Chaco that subsequent researchers have applied to the broader investigation of solar and lunar alignment throughout the canyon's architecture. This methodological rigor has been essential in distinguishing genuine intentional alignments, supported by consistent and repeated astronomical correspondence, from the kind of speculative pattern matching that has sometimes characterized less careful archaeoastronomical claims at other sites around the world. The specific cultural significance that the summer and winter solstices held for the ancestral Pueblo builders of Chaco, marking respectively the longest and shortest days of the year and corresponding to critical transitions in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar, would have made the precise architectural marking of these events a matter of considerable practical as well as cosmological importance, allowing the canyon ceremonial calendar to be synchronized with the solar year with a precision that did not depend on error-prone counting of days, but on the direct and unambiguous observation of light interacting with stone. The specific challenge of maintaining the sun dagger's precise alignment over time has itself become a significant conservation concern, because the slabs that create the dagger effect are not fixed in place by mortar or any permanent structural bond, but rest in their positions through gravity and the specific geological stability of the rock formation, meaning that any shifting of the slabs, whether through natural geological processes or through human disturbance, could permanently alter or destroy the alignment that took the Chacoan builders such patient observation to achieve. Increased visitor traffic to the Sun Dagger site in the years following its initial documentation led to exactly this kind of disturbance, and the site has subsequently been closed to general public access to protect its fragile and irreplaceable alignment. The question of what Chaco Canyon actually was, in terms of its social and political function within the broader Ancestral Pueblo world, has been one of the most actively debated questions in North American archaeology for several decades, and the range of interpretations that have been proposed reflects both the genuine ambiguity of the evidence and the evolving theoretical frameworks that archaeologists have brought to its interpretation. The earliest interpretations of Chaco Canyon, developed in the early and middle 20th century, treated the canyon as a residential center, a city in the conventional sense, housing a substantial resident population engaged in agriculture, craft production, and the other activities of ordinary settled life. This interpretation has been substantially revised by subsequent research, which has found that the great houses of Chaco Canyon contain very few of the hearths, storage facilities, and other domestic features that would be expected if they had functioned as primary residences for large populations on a continuous basis. The room counts that once seemed to imply enormous resident populations now appear, in light of this evidence, to reflect buildings designed primarily for storage, ceremony, and periodic rather than continuous habitation. The alternative interpretation that has gained the most scholarly support in recent decades treats Chaco Canyon as a ceremonial and pilgrimage center, a place where dispersed populations from across the San Juan Basin and beyond gathered periodically for ritual observances, trade, and social and political integration, without the canyon itself supporting more than a modest resident population responsible for maintaining the ceremonial infrastructure between these periodic gatherings. This interpretation is supported by the evidence for episodic, large-scale construction and renovation projects at the great houses, by the evidence for substantial feasting activity in the canyon's middens, and by the specific astronomical alignments that would have given the great gatherings a calendrical structure tied to the solar and lunar cycles. The relationship between Chaco Canyon and the network of outlying communities connected to it by the system of roads radiating from the canyon, some of which extend for more than 50 kilometers across the high desert landscape with a directness and a width that exceeds any practical transportation requirement, is central to understanding the canyon's broader political and social significance. More than 200 Chacoan-style great houses, smaller in scale than the canyon's primary structures but built using similar architectural techniques and often incorporating similar astronomical alignments, have been identified at outlying sites across the Four Corners region, suggesting that Chaco represented the center of an integrated cultural and possibly political system extending across a substantial portion of the American Southwest. The specific archaeological evidence for periodic large-scale gathering at Chaco includes substantial deposits of broken pottery and animal bone concentrated in specific midden areas associated with the great houses, patterns of deposition that are consistent with episodic large-scale feasting events rather than the steady, continuous discard pattern that would be expected from a stable resident population engaged in ordinary daily food preparation and consumption. The specific ceramic evidence, including vessel forms and decorative styles that show influence from multiple distinct regional traditions represented among the broader Chacoan exchange network, similarly supports the interpretation of the canyon as a gathering place that brought together populations and material culture from across a wide geographic area rather than a single homogeneous resident community. The specific debate over whether to characterize the Chacoan system as fundamentally religious, fundamentally political, or some integrated combination of the two reflects a broader theoretical challenge in archaeology generally. The difficulty of applying categories developed within Western intellectual traditions, which tend to separate religious and political authority into distinct domains, to societies whose own conceptual frameworks may not have made the same distinction, treating ceremonial and cosmological authority as inseparable from social and economic organization, rather than as a separate sphere of activity layered on top of an underlying political structure. This theoretical challenge is not unique to Chacoan archaeology, but reflects a broader methodological problem that has affected the interpretation of complex societies throughout the world wherever researchers have attempted to apply categories developed primarily to describe ancient Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, or East Asian state formations to societies whose own internal logic and own categories of social organization developed along entirely different historical trajectories, and the specific scholarly response to this challenge at Chaco, emphasizing close attention to the specific archaeological evidence and sustained engagement with indigenous interpretive frameworks rather than the uncritical application of imported theoretical models, represents a methodologically important contribution that extends well beyond the specific case of Chaco Canyon to inform how archaeologists approach complex pre-state and non-state societies more generally. The roads that connected Chaco Canyon to its outlying communities are among the most enigmatic features of the entire Chacoan system, and their specific characteristics raise questions about their function that the available evidence has not fully resolved. The Chacoan roads, documented through aerial photography and ground survey since the early 20th century, are remarkably straight, often maintaining a consistent bearing across kilometers of terrain regardless of topographic obstacles, and remarkably wide, frequently 9 meters or more across, a width that far exceeds what would be necessary for foot traffic, the primary or exclusive mode of transportation available to the Ancestral Pueblo people, who had no draft animals and no wheeled vehicles. The roads were constructed with a deliberate engineering effort that included the leveling of the road surface, the construction of masonry staircases or ramps to ascend and descend the canyon's sandstone cliffs, and in some cases the placement of stone curbs or borders that gave the roads a formal, constructed quality well beyond what simple footpaths would require. The specific destinations and termination points of many Chacoan roads are puzzling. Some roads appear to terminate at outlying great houses, supporting the interpretation of the road system as primarily connecting the canyon to its dependent or affiliated communities. But other roads appear to terminate at features with no obvious practical significance, including isolated rock formations, or to extend for considerable distances without any documented destination at all, leading some researchers to propose that the roads served primarily ceremonial or cosmological functions, marking sacred pathways or directional alignments rather than functioning as transportation infrastructure in the conventional sense. The Great North Road, one of the most extensively studied of the Chacoan roads, extends due north from the canyon for more than 50 kilometers with remarkable straightness, terminating not at any settlement but at a dramatic natural feature, a series of cliffs and a kiva structure overlooking a steep drop, suggesting that the road's destination was symbolic or ceremonial rather than practical. The specific cardinal orientation of the Great North Road, running almost precisely along the north-south axis, connects to the broader pattern of cardinal and astronomical alignment that characterizes so much of the Chacoan built environment, suggesting that the roads, like the buildings, were oriented according to a cosmological framework that integrated the canyon's sacred geography with the wider landscape of the San Juan Basin. The specific engineering techniques visible in the construction of the Chacoan roads, including the careful grading of road surfaces to maintain a consistent and walkable gradient even across challenging terrain, and the construction of substantial masonry staircases cut directly into sandstone cliff faces to allow the roads to ascend and descend significant elevation changes, document a level of civil engineering sophistication that parallels the architectural sophistication visible in the great houses themselves, suggesting that road construction was understood by Chacoan builders as a parallel and comparably important category of monumental construction, rather than a merely functional afterthought to the architecture. The relationship between the Chacoan road system and similar long-distance pathway systems documented at other major pre-contact civilizations, including the road networks of the Andean world and certain Mesoamerican causeway systems, provides a useful comparative context for understanding how complex societies without wheeled transportation have historically invested in formal, monumental pathway infrastructure for reasons that extend beyond simple transportation efficiency, encompassing ceremonial procession, territorial marking, and the physical expression of cosmological order across the landscape. The specific relationship between road construction and the broader pattern of astronomical and cardinal alignment documented throughout the Chacoan built environment suggests that the canyon's builders understood the landscape itself, not merely its individual buildings, as a medium for the expression of cosmological order, treating the roads as a kind of monumental writing inscribed directly onto the desert surface, legible to anyone who understood the specific astronomical and directional significance encoded into their straight lines and their precise orientations, even though no system of written language was available to record that significance in any more conventional textual form. The specific challenge of interpreting roads whose practical destination and functional purpose remain uncertain has led some researchers to draw on ethnographic analogies from contemporary and historic Pueblo ceremonial practice, where formal processional pathways and specifically marked directional orientations continue to play significant roles in ceremonial life, suggesting that the Chacoan roads may have served functions directly comparable to these documented ceremonial pathways even where their specific archaeological traces do not connect to any settlement that would explain them in purely practical transportation terms. The economic and logistical infrastructure that supported the construction of Chaco Canyon's monumental architecture, in an environment that could not have supported large-scale agricultural surplus through local production alone, is one of the central puzzles of Chacoan archaeology and one that recent research has begun to illuminate in increasing detail. The construction of the great houses required the transportation of an enormous volume of timber, since the canyon's local pinyon and juniper woodlands could not have supplied the ponderosa pine and other large structural timbers needed for roof beams and other major structural elements in the quantities required. Dendrochronological and chemical isotope analysis of timber samples from Chacoan great houses has traced the source of much of this timber to mountain ranges located 50 to 75 kilometers or more from the canyon, including the Chusca Mountains to the west and the San Mateo Mountains to the south, requiring the transportation of tens of thousands of large timbers across substantial distances using only human labor, since the Ancestral Pueblo people had no draft animals capable of hauling heavy loads. The scale of this timber transportation effort, conservatively estimated to have required more than 200,000 individual logs over the course of the canyon's primary construction period, represents an enormous investment of organized labor that must have required some form of coordinated social organization extending well beyond the canyon's own modest resident population. The specific mechanisms through which this labor was organized and mobilized, whether through some form of centralized political authority capable of commanding labor obligations from outlying communities, or through a more decentralized system of ceremonial obligation and reciprocal exchange that motivated voluntary participation in the canyon's construction projects, remains one of the most actively debated questions in Chacoan studies. The food supply required to support the periodic gatherings of large numbers of people at the canyon, whether for construction labor or for ceremonial occasions, similarly exceeded what the canyon's own limited agricultural capacity could have produced, and isotopic and macrobotanical evidence indicates that maize and other foodstuffs were imported into the canyon from outlying agricultural communities, likely as part of the same system of ceremonial obligation and exchange that mobilized timber, and labor. The turkey bones recovered from Chacoan deposits, analyzed using isotopic techniques that can trace dietary sources, indicate that turkeys raised at the canyon were fed maize that had been grown in distant locations and transported to Chaco specifically for this purpose, a detail that illustrates the remarkable degree of logistical integration that the Chacoan system achieved. The specific labor calculations that archaeologists have developed for the construction of individual Chacoan great houses, based on detailed analysis of the volume of stone, timber, and other materials incorporated into structures like Pueblo Bonito, suggests that the construction of the canyon's major buildings would have required the sustained seasonal labor of hundreds of workers over multiple years for any single major construction episode, a labor requirement that could only have been met through the mobilization of workers from a population considerably larger than the canyon's own resident community, reinforcing the broader interpretation of Chaco as a center that drew labor, as it drew timber, food, and ceremonial participation from a dispersed population across the wider San Juan Basin. The specific question of whether this labor mobilization was achieved through coercive political authority, voluntary religious obligation, or some combination of economic incentive and ceremonial duty that does not map cleanly onto either category, remains one of the most actively debated aspects of Chacoan social organization. And the answer likely varied across the 3 centuries of the canyon's primary occupation as the specific political and religious character of the broader Chacoan system itself evolved and changed. The specific archaeological evidence for the organization of construction labor, including patterns in the stylistic consistency or variation visible within individual construction episodes that might indicate whether work crews were drawn from single communities or from multiple different communities working together, provides one avenue through which researchers have attempted to investigate the specific social mechanisms of labor mobilization, though the interpretation of this stylistic evidence remains an active area of methodological development within Chacoan archaeology. The specific comparison between Chacoan labor mobilization and the comparable monumental construction projects documented at other pre-contact civilizations around the world, including the construction of major ceremonial centers in Mesoamerica, South America, and elsewhere, suggests that the mobilization of large-scale collective labor for monumental ceremonial construction in the absence of centralized coercive political authority may have been more common in human history than conventional narratives centered on state-driven monumental construction have generally acknowledged, opening a broader comparative research agenda into the diverse social mechanisms through which human societies have historically organized large-scale collective projects. The social and political organization of Chaco Canyon, and the question of whether the canyon represented a hierarchical, centralized political system comparable to contemporary state societies elsewhere in the world or a more egalitarian system organized around ritual obligation and periodic gathering rather than permanent political hierarchy, is one of the most contested questions in Chacoan archaeology and one with significant implications for how the broader Ancestral Pueblo world is understood. The discovery of elite burials within Pueblo Bonito, including 2 adjacent rooms containing the remains of individuals buried with substantial quantities of turquoise, shell, and other valuable materials, has been cited as evidence for the existence of a hereditary elite class with substantially greater access to wealth and status than the broader population. Genetic analysis of the individuals buried in these rooms, published in 2017, found that they were related through the maternal line across multiple generations, suggesting a matrilineal dynasty that maintained its status at the canyon for an extended period, a finding that has been interpreted by some researchers as strong evidence for a hierarchical political structure with hereditary leadership. Other researchers have challenged this interpretation, noting that ethnographic and historical evidence from the contemporary Pueblo societies that are the descendants of the Chacoan world consistently describes social and political organization built around ritual societies, clan structures, and forms of leadership that are situational and consensus-based rather than hereditary and coercive in the manner typically associated with state-level political hierarchy. The specific cultural framework of the contemporary Pueblo peoples, who maintain detailed oral traditions about the significance of Chaco Canyon and who continue to make ceremonial pilgrimages to the canyon as part of ongoing religious practice, provides an important indigenous perspective on the canyon's social organization that some archaeologists argue should be given greater weight in interpreting the ambiguous archaeological evidence. The specific question of whether Chaco represented something resembling a state, with centralized political authority capable of commanding labor and tribute from a dependent population, or a fundamentally different kind of social formation organized around ceremonial obligation, periodic gathering, and a form of authority that was religious and cosmological rather than coercive and political in the conventional sense, may reflect the limitations of applying categories developed to describe old world state societies to a social formation that does not map cleanly onto those categories, and the most productive recent scholarship on Chaco has increasingly emphasized the need to understand the canyon on its own specific cultural terms rather than through frameworks imported from elsewhere. The specific architectural evidence for social differentiation within Pueblo Bonito itself, including variation in room size, construction quality, and the distribution of high-value materials across different sections of the building, provides additional evidence relevant to the broader question of Chacoan social hierarchy, though the interpretation of this architectural variation remains contested, with some researchers reading it as evidence for residential differentiation by social status, and others interpreting it as reflecting differences in ceremonial function rather than social rank among the people who used different sections of the building. The contemporary Pueblo perspective on Chacoan social organization, which emphasizes the continuity between Chacoan ceremonial structures and the clan and ceremonial society organization documented among historic and contemporary Pueblo communities, suggests an alternative framework for understanding the canyon's elite burials and architectural differentiation, one in which specific ceremonial roles and responsibilities, rather than generalized political and economic power, may have been the primary basis for the social distinctions that the archaeological record documents. The broader anthropological literature on heterarchy, a concept developed specifically to describe social systems characterized by multiple, overlapping forms of authority and status differentiation that do not resolve into a single linear hierarchy of the kind associated with conventional state formation, has been increasingly applied to the interpretation of Chacoan social organization, offering a theoretical framework that can accommodate the genuine complexity and ambiguity of the archaeological evidence without forcing it into either a strictly hierarchical state model or an undifferentiated egalitarian model, neither of which fully captures what the evidence from Pueblo Bonito and the broader Chacoan system actually documents. The specific application of hierarchical models to Chaco has also drawn productive comparison with similarly complex but non-state societies documented elsewhere in the archaeological record, including certain African kingdoms and Pacific Island chiefdoms whose own social organization combines elements of hierarchy and egalitarianism in ways that resist easy classification within conventional anthropological typologies, suggesting that Chaco's apparent ambiguity may reflect a genuine and widespread category of human social organization, rather than simply an artifact of insufficient archaeological evidence. The material culture recovered from Chaco Canyon, including the substantial quantities of imported materials found in ceremonial and elite contexts throughout the canyon's great houses, documents an extensive network of exchange relationships that connected the canyon to distant regions of North America and that illuminates both the canyon's economic significance and its broader cosmological and ritual concerns. Turquoise is among the most abundant and most significant of the imported materials recovered from Chaco Canyon, with tens of thousands of turquoise beads, pendants, and inlay pieces documented from excavations at Pueblo Bonito alone. Chemical sourcing studies of Chacoan turquoise have identified sources in multiple locations across the broader Southwest, including deposits in present-day Nevada, Colorado, and California, indicating that the canyon was integrated into exchange networks extending across a substantial portion of the western United States. The specific significance of turquoise in Ancestral Pueblo and broader southwestern cosmology, where the stone's blue-green color was associated with water, fertility, and the life-giving rain that was the most precious and most uncertain resource in the arid southwestern environment, gives the material a ritual significance beyond its purely decorative or economic value. Marine shell, including shell from the Pacific coast of California and from the Gulf of California, documents exchange relationships extending in the opposite direction, connecting Chaco to coastal trading networks hundreds of kilometers distant. The presence of scarlet macaw remains at Chaco Canyon, a tropical bird species native to regions of Mexico located more than 1,500 kilometers to the south, is one of the most dramatic pieces of evidence for the geographic extent of Chacoan exchange relationships, documenting connections to Mesoamerican trading networks that brought live tropical birds, prized for their brilliant plumage and likely associated with specific ceremonial and cosmological significance, across enormous distances to the high desert canyon. Cylinder jars, a distinctive and relatively rare ceramic vessel form found concentrated at Pueblo Bonito and a small number of other elite Chacoan contexts, have been found through chemical residue analysis to have contained cacao, the source material for chocolate, originating from Mesoamerica. This finding, published in 2009, was one of the most striking discoveries in recent Chacoan archaeology, documenting not merely the exchange of raw materials but the specific transmission of a ceremonial beverage tradition from Mesoamerica to the canyon, complete with the specialized vessel forms associated with its consumption, suggesting cultural and possibly ideological connections between Chaco and the great urban civilizations of Mexico that were considerably more direct and more substantive than previous interpretations had assumed. The specific chemical and isotopic techniques that have made these discoveries possible, including mass spectrometry analysis capable of detecting trace residues of theobromine, the chemical marker specific to cacao, on ceramic vessel interiors centuries after their last use, represent a broader transformation in archaeological method that has dramatically expanded the kinds of questions that can be answered from existing museum collections without requiring new excavation, allowing researchers to extract new information from artifacts that have been stored in institutional collections for decades. The specific significance of cacao consumption at Chaco extends beyond the simple fact of long-distance exchange to raise questions about the specific ceremonial and social contexts in which this exotic and presumably high-status beverage was consumed, and about the broader pattern of selective adoption through which Chacoan elites incorporated specific elements of Mesoamerican ceremonial practice, including the cylinder jar vessel form itself, an unusual and otherwise unprecedented shape in the broader Ancestral Pueblo ceramic tradition, into their own distinct ceremonial and cosmological system. The specific archaeological context in which the cylinder jars were recovered concentrated heavily within Pueblo Bonito itself rather than distributed broadly across the canyon's various great houses, suggests that cacao consumption and the broader Mesoamerican ceremonial practices associated with it were restricted to a specific elite or ceremonially specialized segment of Chacoan society rather than practiced broadly, reinforcing the broader pattern of social and ceremonial differentiation that the canyon's archaeological record documents in multiple independent lines of evidence. The specific question of how cacao itself, along with the knowledge of its ceremonial preparation and consumption, traveled the considerable distance from its Mesoamerican source regions to the high desert of New Mexico, whether through a continuous chain of intermediary trading relationships extending across multiple distinct cultural regions, or through more direct long-distance contact between Chacoan and Mesoamerican populations, remains an open question that ongoing research into the broader exchange networks connecting the American Southwest to Mesoamerica continues to investigate. The architecture of Pueblo Bonito itself, the largest and most thoroughly excavated of the Chacoan great houses, rewards close attention because its specific construction history, spanning more than 3 centuries of building, modification, and renovation, illustrates the broader patterns of Chacoan development across the canyon's primary occupation period. Pueblo Bonito's construction began in the mid-9th century with a relatively modest arc of rooms along what would become the building's northern wall, and the structure was progressively expanded over the following 2.5 centuries through multiple distinct construction episodes, each adding new room blocks, additional stories, and increasingly elaborate architectural features. The building's mature form, achieved by the early 12th century, encompassed the full D-shaped plan with its massive curving north wall and its open southern plaza, divided by a row of rooms that may have separated the complex into eastern and western precincts with potentially distinct ceremonial or social functions. The specific masonry styles visible in different sections of Pueblo Bonito, ranging from relatively simple coursed rubble construction in the earliest sections to the elaborate banded and patterned veneer work of the later additions, provide archaeologists with a relative chronology of the building's construction sequence even in the absence of written records. And the application of dendrochronological dating to the timbers incorporated into different sections of the structure has allowed this masonry chronology to be calibrated against an absolute calendar with remarkable precision in many cases. The great kivas and smaller kivas incorporated into Pueblo Bonito's plan, including several large circular ceremonial structures built into the building's central plaza and room blocks, document the centrality of communal ceremony to the structure's function, and the specific architectural elaboration of these ceremonial spaces, which often exceed the great house's residential rooms in both scale and architectural sophistication, supports the broader interpretation of Chaco's great houses as primarily ceremonial rather than residential structures. The specific orientation of Pueblo Bonito's overall plan, with its long curving wall facing north and its open plaza facing south toward the canyon's most exposed solar aspect, reflects the broader pattern of solar awareness that characterizes Chacoan architecture generally, and recent research has identified specific correspondences between the building's major axes and both the cardinal directions and certain solar alignments, adding Pueblo Bonito's overall plan to the growing catalog of astronomically informed design decisions documented throughout the canyon's monumental architecture. The specific sequence of construction episodes documented at Pueblo Bonito, each adding new architectural elements while generally preserving and incorporating the earlier construction rather than demolishing and rebuilding, suggests a building tradition that valued continuity and cumulative elaboration over wholesale renewal, treating the great house as a living structure that grew and changed across generations while maintaining its fundamental identity and its core ceremonial functions. Throughout this long process of expansion, the specific masonry style transitions visible within Pueblo Bonito's walls, where archaeologists have identified at least 4 distinct construction styles corresponding to different building episodes across the structure's history, provide a particularly clear illustration of how stylistic analysis of standing architecture can recover a detailed construction chronology even at sites where written records are entirely absent. The earliest style, characterized by relatively crude coursed masonry using unshaped sandstone blocks, gives way in later construction episodes to increasingly refined techniques involving carefully selected and shaped veneer stones arranged in deliberate decorative bands, a stylistic progression that parallels and confirms the chronology established independently through tree ring dating of the structure's wooden roof beams and support posts. The specific preservation of these wooden architectural elements, many of which survive in remarkably good condition despite their age, owes much to the extreme aridity of the canyon's climate, which has limited the kind of fungal decay and insect damage that destroys wooden structural elements much more rapidly in more humid environments, giving Chacoan archaeology access to an unusually well-preserved body of dendrochronological evidence that has made the canyon's chronology one of the most precisely dated archaeological sequences anywhere in the pre-contact Americas. This precision in dating has allowed researchers to identify specific years in which major construction episodes at Pueblo Bonito and other great houses occurred, sometimes narrowing the timing of a particular renovation or expansion to within a single building season, a level of chronological resolution that is rarely achievable at archaeological sites anywhere in the world and that has transformed Chaco Canyon into something of a methodological proving ground for the broader application of dendrochronological techniques to pre-contact American archaeology. The decline and eventual depopulation of Chaco Canyon, beginning in the 12th century and essentially complete by the middle of the 13th, represents one of the most significant transitions in the history of the Ancestral Pueblo world, and the specific causes and consequences of this transition have been the subject of extensive archaeological and paleoclimatic research. The paleoclimatic record for the San Juan Basin, reconstructed from tree ring data with a precision and an annual resolution that few other regions of the world can match, documents a severe and sustained drought beginning in the 1130s and continuing with only partial relief for several decades. A climatic event that would have placed enormous stress on the agricultural systems that supported both the canyon's own population and the outlying communities whose surplus production had sustained the periodic gatherings and construction projects of the canyon's height. The coincidence of this drought period with the beginning of Chaco's decline has led most researchers to treat climatic stress as a major, though probably not the sole, factor in the canyon's eventual depopulation. The specific process of Chaco's decline was not a sudden abandonment but a gradual transition extending over several decades, during which monumental construction activity in the canyon slowed and eventually ceased, while new centers of monumental construction emerged at outlying locations including Aztec ruins and Salmon ruins to the north, suggesting a relocation of the broader Chacoan system's ceremonial and political center of gravity rather than a complete collapse of the cultural tradition that Chaco represented. The continuity of architectural style, ceramic tradition, and ceremonial practice between Chaco and these successor centers indicates that the underlying Ancestral Pueblo cultural system persisted through and beyond the specific decline of the Chaco Canyon Center itself. The broader 13th century reorganization of Ancestral Pueblo settlement across the Four Corners region, which saw population movement toward the more reliable water sources of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi Mesas and other locations that would become the home of the historic and contemporary Pueblo communities, represents the final chapter of the specific cultural trajectory that Chaco Canyon initiated, and the direct genealogical and cultural continuity between the Chacoan world and the contemporary Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona is affirmed both by archaeological evidence and by the oral traditions of the Pueblo communities themselves, who maintain detailed knowledge of their ancestors' migrations and of the specific significance of Chaco Canyon within that migration history. The specific archaeological signatures of this 13th century reorganization, including the abandonment of the high desert canyon and mesatop settlements that had characterized the broader Chacoan world and the consolidation of population into larger, more defensively organized settlements in locations with more reliable water access, suggests that the broader stresses of the drought period extended beyond agricultural difficulty to encompass increased social tension and possibly increased conflict between communities competing for increasingly scarce resources, a pattern documented archaeologically through evidence for fortification and defensive site selection that becomes increasingly common in the 13th century Southwest. The specific relationship between the Chaco Canyon decline and the broader 13th century depopulation of the Four Corners region as a whole, including the dramatic abandonment of cliff-dwelling sites like those at Mesa Verde that occurred within roughly the same general period, suggests that the climatic and social pressures affecting the broader Ancestral Pueblo world during this period extended well beyond the specific Chacoan system, representing a regional crisis that reshaped settlement patterns across the entire Four Corners area rather than a localized phenomenon specific to the canyon itself. The specific paleoclimatic mechanisms underlying the 13th century drought, including the changes in Pacific Ocean temperature patterns now understood to drive much of the interannual and decadal variability in southwestern precipitation, have been reconstructed with increasing precision through the integration of tree ring data with other paleoclimatic proxies including lake sediment cores and speleothem records from regional cave systems, providing climate scientists studying contemporary climate change with a detailed historical analog for understanding how southwestern agricultural societies have responded to past episodes of sustained drought stress, lessons that carry direct relevance for contemporary water management planning in the same region today. The specific resonance between the 13th century Chacoan drought and the contemporary climate crisis facing the same region, where decades of below-average precipitation combined with increasing temperatures have created water management challenges that echo, in modern form, the same fundamental vulnerability that confronted the canyon's ancient farmers, has given Chacoan archaeology an unexpected contemporary relevance, with researchers and water managers increasingly looking to the deep historical record preserved at Chaco for insight into how human societies in this specific environment have responded to climatic stress across the centuries. The relationship between Chaco Canyon and the contemporary Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who consider the canyon's builders to be their direct ancestors and who maintain ongoing ceremonial and cultural connections to the site, is essential context for understanding both the canyon's historical significance and the appropriate framework for its contemporary study and management. The oral traditions maintained by multiple contemporary Pueblo communities, including the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, including Acama, Laguna, and others, document detailed knowledge of ancestral migrations that connect their communities to Chaco Canyon and to the broader ancestral Pueblo world of the Four Corners region. These oral traditions, while not always corresponding precisely to the archaeological chronology in their specific details, provide an indigenous historical framework for understanding the significance of Chaco that complements and in some respects exceeds what the archaeological evidence alone can establish, particularly regarding the specific religious and cosmological significance that the canyon held for its builders. The continuing ceremonial significance of Chaco Canyon for contemporary Pueblo communities, who continue to conduct pilgrimages and ceremonial observances at the site as part of ongoing religious practice, represents a form of cultural continuity that distinguishes Chaco from many other major archaeological sites where the descendant communities of the original builders have been displaced, converted, or culturally discontinuous with their ancestors. This continuity gives the archaeological study of Chaco Canyon an ethical dimension that requires ongoing consultation and collaboration with descendant Pueblo communities, whose knowledge of the site's significance and whose authority over questions of appropriate research and interpretation has been increasingly recognized in recent decades of archaeological practice at the site. The specific collaborative frameworks that have developed between the National Park Service, which manages Chaco Canyon as a national historical park, and the Pueblo communities with ancestral connections to the site, including formal consultation requirements and collaborative research initiatives, represent an evolving model for the ethical management of indigenous archaeological heritage that has influenced practice at archaeological sites elsewhere in North America and that reflects a broader transformation in how the discipline of archaeology approaches its relationship with the descendant communities of the peoples whose past it studies. The specific tension that sometimes arises between archaeological research priorities and Pueblo community concerns about the appropriate handling of human remains, sacred objects, and other categories of material that hold particular religious or cultural significance for descendant communities, has been addressed through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and through the development of more specific institutional protocols at Chaco Culture National Historical Park that govern the treatment and, where appropriate, the repatriation of culturally sensitive materials recovered through both historical and ongoing archaeological work at the site. The educational programming developed at Chaco Canyon in collaboration with Pueblo communities, which incorporates indigenous perspectives on the site's significance alongside the archaeological and scientific narrative more commonly presented at National Park Service sites, represents an evolving approach to public interpretation that aims to present the canyon's history in a way that does justice to both the scientific evidence and the living cultural traditions that continue to understand Chaco as ancestral and sacred ground rather than simply as an object of historical curiosity. The specific protocols governing archaeological research access to Chaco Canyon, which require formal consultation with affiliated Pueblo communities before new excavation or other invasive research can proceed, reflect a broader shift in American archaeological practice toward treating descendant indigenous communities as active partners and authorities in the research process rather than as passive subjects of external scientific investigation, a shift that has been particularly significant. At Chaco, given the site's continuing ceremonial importance and the unbroken cultural connection between the canyon's ancient builders and its contemporary Pueblo descendants. The specific repatriation cases that have been resolved at Chaco Canyon, returning human remains and culturally sensitive objects to the appropriate descendant communities following consultation processes that can extend over multiple years given the complexity of establishing specific cultural affiliation for materials excavated decades or in some cases more than a century ago, illustrate both the practical challenges and the ethical importance of this ongoing repatriation work, which has required sustained institutional commitment from the National Park Service, from university and museum collections holding Chacoan materials excavated during earlier periods of less consultative archaeological practice, and from the Pueblo communities themselves, who have invested considerable effort in establishing the specific cultural protocols and procedures necessary to receive and properly care for repatriated materials. The specific astronomical and calendrical knowledge embedded in Chaco Canyon's architecture raises broader questions about the cognitive and observational sophistication of the ancestral Pueblo astronomical tradition, and about how this knowledge was developed, maintained, and transmitted across the generations of the canyon's three-century occupation. The development of the kind of precise solar and lunar alignment documented throughout the Chacoan-built environment would have required sustained, systematic observation of the sun's and moon's positions relative to the horizon over multiple years, and in the case of the lunar standstill alignments, over multiple decades. A level of observational commitment that implies the existence of specialized astronomical knowledge holders, whether organized as a distinct priesthood or as a specific ceremonial responsibility integrated into the broader religious leadership of Chacoan society. The specific methods by which Chacoan astronomers tracked these celestial cycles, in the absence of any documented system of writing or numerical notation comparable to that developed by contemporary Mesoamerican civilizations, remain uncertain, though the architecture itself, with its precisely oriented windows, doorways, and corner alignments, may have functioned as a form of observational instrument as well as a record of astronomical knowledge already achieved. The relationship between Chacoan astronomical knowledge and the broader astronomical traditions documented among historic and contemporary Pueblo peoples, who maintain detailed ceremonial calendars tied to solar and lunar observations and who continue to use specific landscape features, including horizon markers analogous to those that may have been employed at Chaco to track the progression of the agricultural and ceremonial year, provides an important ethnographic analogy for understanding how the Chacoan astronomical system may have functioned in practice, even though the specific continuity between Chacoan and historic Pueblo astronomical practice cannot be established with certainty given the centuries and the cultural transformations that separate them. The specific cosmological significance of astronomical alignment in Chacoan and broader Pueblo thought appears to extend beyond the practical calendrical function of marking agricultural and ceremonial dates to encompass a broader understanding of the built environment as a means of connecting human society to the cosmic order, integrating the architecture, the ceremonial practice, and the astronomical observation into a unified system of cosmological understanding that the surviving archaeological evidence allows us to glimpse, even if its full conceptual content, the specific beliefs and meanings that the Chacoan people themselves attach to these alignments, remains beyond what the physical evidence alone can recover. The specific possibility that astronomical knowledge holders at Chaco occupied a distinct and specialized social role, comparable in certain respects to the astronomer priests documented in considerably more detail among contemporary Mesoamerican civilizations, whose written records provide direct evidence for the social organization of astronomical knowledge, would help explain the sustained, multi-generational observational programs that the canyon's lunar standstill alignments in particular would have required, though the absence of comparable written evidence at Chaco means that this specific social organization of astronomical knowledge must remain a plausible inference rather than a documented fact. The broader comparative study of archaeoastronomy across multiple pre-contact American civilizations, including not only Chaco and the Mesoamerican traditions, but also the astronomical knowledge documented at sites ranging from the Mississippian mound complexes to the Andean world, reveals a widespread pattern of sophisticated astronomical observation integrated into monumental architecture and ceremonial practice across the pre-contact Americas, suggesting that the specific achievement at Chaco, while remarkable, was part of a broader continental pattern of astronomical sophistication rather than an isolated anomaly. The specific intellectual achievement represented by the Chacoan astronomical system deserves to be understood on its own cultural terms rather than primarily through comparison with other traditions, since the specific cosmological framework within which Chacoan astronomers operated, their understanding of the relationship between celestial cycles and the broader order of the world, and the specific ceremonial purposes that their astronomical knowledge served, were shaped by the particular history and particular beliefs of the Ancestral Pueblo world rather than being a generic example of a universal human astronomical impulse. And the work of understanding what Chacoan astronomy meant to the people who practiced it remains an ongoing project that benefits enormously from continuing dialogue with contemporary Pueblo communities whose own ceremonial traditions preserve elements of the broader cosmological framework within which their ancestors' astronomical achievements at Chaco were originally embedded. The specific experience of visiting Chaco Canyon today, managed by the National Park Service as Chaco Culture National Historical Park and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is shaped by the canyon's continuing remoteness, which has both preserved the site from the kind of development pressure that has affected many other major archaeological sites in North America and limited the number of visitors able to experience it directly. The approach to Chaco Canyon, requiring travel over miles of unpaved road through the same high desert landscape that the canyon's ancient inhabitants would have crossed on foot, gives the modern visitor an immediate sense of the canyon's isolation from the more agriculturally productive and more easily accessible regions of the Southwest, a quality of remoteness that may have been central to the canyon's original ceremonial significance as a place set apart from ordinary settlement and ordinary life. The specific physical effort required to reach the canyon, even with modern vehicles, echoes in modified form the pilgrimage journey that ancient visitors would have undertaken on foot from outlying communities scattered across the San Juan Basin. The visitor experience of Pueblo Bonito and the canyon's other great houses, walking through room blocks and plazas that retain much of their original architectural form despite centuries of partial collapse and erosion, provides a direct physical encounter with the scale and the craftsmanship of Chacoan construction that photographs and descriptions cannot fully convey. The specific quality of light in the high desert, with its extraordinary clarity and its dramatic seasonal variation in the angle and duration of sunlight, recreates something of the visual environment within which the canyon's astronomical alignments would have been observed and experienced by their original builders and users. The night sky visible at Chaco Canyon, largely free of the light pollution that obscures astronomical observation throughout most of the developed world, has been recognized through International Dark Sky Park certification as one of the most significant such viewing locations in North America, and the specific experience of viewing the night sky from within the canyon, with the same constellations and the same lunar and solar cycles that the canyon's architecture was designed to track still visible in their full clarity, offers contemporary visitors one of the most direct possible connections to the observational world of the canyon's ancient astronomers. The specific seasonal experience of visiting Chaco Canyon varies dramatically across the year, with summer visits bringing intense heat and the dramatic thunderstorms characteristic of the southwestern monsoon season, and winter visits offering a starkly different experience of cold, clear air and the specific quality of low-angle winter light that would have been central to the observation and marking of the winter solstice that several of the canyon's major structures are oriented to track. Visitors who time their visit to coincide with either solstice can observe, under the guidance of National Park Service rangers and in coordination with the broader astronomical research community, the same solar alignments that the canyon's ancient builders designed their architecture to capture. The specific preservation challenges facing Chaco Canyon's standing architecture, including the ongoing effects of erosion, the structural stresses created by centuries of partial collapse and exposure to the elements, and the increasing pressure of climate change on the already fragile sandstone construction that characterizes the great houses, require ongoing conservation investment and monitoring that the National Park Service conducts in collaboration with structural engineers, geologists, and the broader archaeological research community to ensure that the site's architecture remains accessible to future generations of visitors and researchers. The specific visitor center exhibits and ranger-led educational programming at Chaco Culture National Historical Park aim to communicate both the archaeological evidence for the canyon's history and the contemporary Pueblo perspective on its ongoing significance, presenting visitors with a more complete and more historically responsible picture of the site than the purely archaeological narrative that earlier generations of park interpretation tended to emphasize, reflecting the broader collaborative relationship that has developed between the National Park Service and the affiliated Pueblo communities over recent decades of site management. The specific seasonal rhythms of visitation at Chaco Canyon, with peak visitor numbers occurring during the more moderate spring and fall months and during the specific solstice periods when ranger-led astronomical programming draws visitors interested in directly observing the canyon's solar alignments, reflect the broader pattern of how the site's specific scientific and cultural significance has shaped contemporary visitor experience and expectation, with many visitors arriving specifically informed about and interested in the astronomical dimension of the site's significance rather than approaching it as a generic archaeological ruin, a pattern of visitor engagement that the park's interpretive programming has increasingly been designed to support and to deepen. The broader significance of Chaco Canyon within the history of pre-contact North American civilization extends beyond its specific astronomical and architectural achievements to encompass what the site reveals about the diversity and sophistication of indigenous political, social, and religious systems that developed across the Americas prior to European contact. The scale and sophistication of Chacoan achievement challenges persistent popular misconceptions about pre-contact North American societies as universally small-scale, technologically simple, and lacking the kind of complex social and political organization associated with state-level civilizations elsewhere in the world. While the specific form of social and political organization that Chaco represented remains debated, the sheer scale of its monumental architecture, the sophistication of its astronomical knowledge system, and the geographic extent of its exchange relationships document a civilization of considerable complexity, organizational capacity, and intellectual achievement that deserves recognition alongside the better-known monumental civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America. The comparison between Chaco Canyon and other major pre-contact North American archaeological complexes, including Cahokia in the Mississippi River Valley and the various complexes of the broader Mississippian cultural tradition, illuminates both the specific achievements of each regional tradition and the broader pattern of monumental ceremonial center development that characterized multiple distinct regions of pre-contact North America during roughly overlapping periods, suggesting parallel processes of social and political complexity emerging independently in different ecological and cultural contexts across the continent. The specific legacy of Chacoan astronomical knowledge and architectural achievement in the broader history of Native American intellectual tradition deserves recognition as one of the most sophisticated bodies of observational science developed anywhere in the pre-contact Americas, comparable in its specific achievements, though different in its cultural expression and its technological context, to the astronomical traditions developed by Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Maya, whose own sophisticated calendrical and astronomical systems are more widely recognized in popular understanding of pre-contact American achievement than the comparable sophistication documented at Chaco Canyon. The specific historiographical pattern through which Mesoamerican achievements have received greater popular and even scholarly recognition than comparable North American achievements reflects, in part, the greater availability of written documentation for Mesoamerican civilizations, whose hieroglyphic and codex traditions provide direct textual evidence for astronomical and calendrical knowledge that can be more readily communicated to general audiences than the indirect architectural and archaeoastronomical evidence on which our understanding of Chacoan knowledge depends, a disparity in source material that has shaped popular perception of relative achievement in ways that do not accurately reflect the actual sophistication of the underlying astronomical traditions involved. The specific contribution that continued archaeological and archaeoastronomical research at Chaco Canyon makes to correcting this popular misperception by providing an increasingly detailed and increasingly accessible body of evidence for the sophistication of Ancestral Pueblo astronomical knowledge, represents one of the broader public benefits of ongoing scholarly investment in the site, helping to establish a more accurate and more complete popular understanding of the intellectual achievements of pre-contact North American civilizations alongside the better-known achievements of Mesoamerica and South America. The broader public communication of Chacoan achievement, through documentary media, museum exhibition, and educational programming at the national park itself, plays an important role in this ongoing correction of popular historical understanding, presenting Chaco Canyon not as a curiosity or a mystery to be solved, but as a documented achievement of a sophisticated civilization whose specific intellectual and architectural accomplishments deserve to be understood and appreciated on their own terms, within the context of the broader Ancestral Pueblo cultural tradition from which they emerged and which continues today in the living communities of the contemporary Pueblo peoples. The specific recognition that pre-contact North America hosted multiple, geographically dispersed centers of monumental construction, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and complex long-distance exchange relationships, rather than being a uniformly simple landscape of small-scale societies prior to European contact, has significant implications for how the broader history of the Americas is taught and understood, challenging persistent narratives that have historically minimized the scale and sophistication of indigenous North American achievement in ways that serve to justify the dispossession and displacement that followed European colonization, and the continued archaeological investigation and public communication of sites like Chaco Canyon plays an important role in correcting this historically consequential misrepresentation. The ongoing archaeological and scientific research at Chaco Canyon continues to refine and in some cases substantially revise the understanding of the canyon's history, its social organization, and its broader significance within the Ancestral Pueblo world, reflecting the continuing vitality of Chacoan studies as an active area of archaeological research. Recent genetic, isotopic, and chemical sourcing research has added significant new dimensions to the understanding of Chacoan social organization, exchange relationships, and population history that were not available to earlier generations of researchers working primarily from architectural and ceramic evidence. The application of strontium isotope analysis to human remains from Chacoan contexts, which can identify the specific geographic regions where individuals spent their childhood based on the chemical signature of local water and food sources absorbed into their bones and teeth, has provided direct evidence for the geographic origins of individuals who lived and died at the canyon, supporting the broader interpretation of Chaco as a center that drew population, materials, and ceremonial participation from across a wide geographic area. The application of LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies to the broader Chacoan landscape has continued to refine understanding of the road system, the distribution of outlying great houses, and the broader settlement pattern of the Chacoan world, revealing additional features and connections that ground-based survey alone had not identified. The integration of this remote sensing data with traditional excavation and with the oral historical knowledge of contemporary Pueblo communities represents a methodologically sophisticated and ethically grounded approach to Chacoan research that reflects the broader maturation of the discipline's engagement with indigenous archaeological heritage. The specific questions that remain unresolved in Chacoan archaeology, including the precise nature of the canyon's political organization, the specific mechanisms through which labor and materials were mobilized for its construction, and the full conceptual content of its astronomical and cosmological system, ensure that Chaco Canyon will remain one of the most actively studied and most intellectually generative archaeological sites in North America for the foreseeable future, continuing to yield new insights as new methods and new collaborative frameworks are brought to bear on its interpretation. The specific challenge of climate change for the long-term preservation and interpretation of Chaco Canyon, including the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events that threaten the structural integrity of the canyon's sandstone architecture and the broader ecological changes affecting the high desert landscape within which the site is embedded, has become an increasingly significant concern for the site's managers and for the broader research community invested in its long-term preservation, adding urgency to ongoing conservation and documentation efforts that aim to record the site's current condition as comprehensively as possible. The specific role of digital documentation technologies, including detailed 3D laser scanning of the canyon's major architectural features, in creating a permanent and infinitely reproducible record of the site's current condition that will remain available to researchers and to the public regardless of whatever physical changes the site may undergo in coming decades, represents an important complement to traditional physical conservation efforts, ensuring that even if specific architectural features are eventually lost to erosion or structural collapse, the detailed record of their current form and their precise astronomical alignments will be permanently preserved for future study and appreciation. The broader trajectory of Chacoan studies over the past half-century, from the early structuralist interpretations that emphasized centralized political authority to the more recent emphasis on ritual practice, indigenous knowledge, and the limitations of imported analytical categories, illustrates the broader evolution of archaeological theory and method that has transformed how researchers approach not only Chaco Canyon specifically but pre-contact American archaeology more generally, reflecting a discipline that has become increasingly attentive to indigenous perspectives, increasingly sophisticated in its scientific methodology, and increasingly cautious about imposing interpretive frameworks developed for other contexts onto the specific and irreducible particularity of the Chacoan case. The specific funding and institutional support structures that sustain ongoing research at Chaco Canyon, including partnerships between the National Park Service, university research programs, and Pueblo community organizations, have proven essential to maintaining the kind of sustained, methodologically sophisticated, and ethically grounded research program that the site's continued archaeological significance requires, and the specific model of collaborative research developed at Chaco has increasingly been looked to as an example for how archaeological research at other culturally sensitive sites across North America might be similarly structured to balance scientific inquiry with respect for descendant community authority and concern. Chaco Canyon stands in the high desert of New Mexico exactly where it has stood for more than 1,000 years, the great curving wall of Pueblo Bonito still rising against the canyon's northern cliff, the windows and doorways of its great houses still aligned with the precision their builders achieved through patient observation of the sun and the moon across multiple human lifetimes, the petroglyph spiral on Fajada Butte still waiting for the dagger of summer light that has found its center. Every June solstice for 1,000 years. The civilization that built Chaco is not gone. It transformed, as all living cultures transform, and its direct descendants live today in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, who maintain their connection to the canyon through ceremony, through oral tradition, and through an unbroken cultural continuity that distinguishes Chaco from archaeological sites whose builders left no traceable descendants. The questions that the canyon poses, about what kind of society could organize the labor of thousands of people across a landscape with no draft animals and no wheeled transport, about what kind of knowledge system could track a lunar cycle that takes nearly 2 decades to complete, about what kind of conviction could move communities to haul timber for 70 kilometers across the desert for buildings that may have stood empty for most of the year, are questions that the available evidence answers only partially. What remains complete is the precision. The summer solstice sun still finds the center of the spiral on Fajada Butte. The doorway at Casa Rinconada still frames the rising sun at the solstice with the same exactness it was built to achieve. The Great North Road still runs true to the cardinal direction its builders intended, regardless of what lay at its end or why they built it. Whatever else about Chaco Canyon remains uncertain, the astronomical knowledge of its builders does not. It is written into the stone itself, readable by anyone willing to stand in the right place at the right moment and watch the light do what it was built to do. The canyon asks for patience, the same patience its builders practiced across the centuries of observation that produced its alignments. It does not yield its full meaning to a quick visit or a simple explanation. It asks instead for the kind of attention that its astronomers gave to the horizon, the kind of attention that notices, over years and decades, the small and consistent patterns that add up to genuine understanding. Chaco Canyon has been waiting in this high desert for 1,000 years. It is in no hurry to be fully understood. The light will return to the spiral at the next solstice, as it has for 10 centuries, whether or not we have finished arguing about what it means. That patience, more than any specific theory of who the Chacoans were or what they intended, may be the canyon's most important lesson for anyone willing to sit with it long enough to learn. The desert does not rush. It has built its sandstone in layers laid down over millions of years, and the people who came to understand it well enough to build Pueblo Bonito and to track the moon's 19-year wandering did so by matching that patience, by watching for years what most of us would only watch for minutes, and by trusting that the careful accumulation of small observations would eventually resolve into knowledge worth building in stone. That knowledge is still here, in the alignment of every doorway that catches the solstice sun, in every wall that points true to a cardinal direction, in every road that runs straight across the desert toward a destination whose meaning we can only guess at. The canyon kept its promises. It is still keeping them, every June and every December, in the silent and exact language of light on stone. Anyone can learn to read it. All it takes is the patience to stand still long enough, in the right place, at the right time of year, and watch. The canyon has been waiting for someone to do exactly that since before most of the world's other great monuments were built, and it will go on waiting, in the same silence, for as long as the desert holds its shape. That is the canyon's final lesson, perhaps its most important one, that some of the truest things in the world reveal themselves only to those willing to wait for them, not on human schedules, but on the slower schedules of the sun and the moon and the patient stone that holds their record. For 1,000 years, Chaco Canyon has kept its appointments with the solstice sun and the standstill moon without fail. It is keeping one right now, and it will keep the next one too, long after this telling of its story has ended and the next one has begun. The light moves. The stone stays. And somewhere in that exchange, repeated every year for 1,000 years and counting, is the answer to a question that the canyon has been patiently demonstrating since long before anyone thought to ask it aloud. Whether that answer is about astronomy, or about devotion, or about the kind of patience that outlasts empires, the canyon has never been in a hurry to explain itself, and it is not about to start now. It will simply keep doing what it has always done, standing in the high desert, holding the light at the appointed moments, and trusting that someone, somewhere, will always be watching closely enough to notice. The desert has time. It always has. And for those willing to share even a little of that patience, Chaco Canyon still has its oldest and most reliable gift to offer. The quiet certainty that the sun will return to the same place on the horizon, that the moon will complete its long and patient wandering, and that some things, built carefully enough and watched closely enough, can outlast the civilizations that made them. Chaco Canyon has. It is still here. It is still watching the sky. And it will be, long after we are gone. That is, perhaps, the truest thing anyone can say about Chaco Canyon. Not what it was, which remains debated, but what it does, which has never changed. It marks the light. It always has. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.